Hi everyone, this is DKeys bringing you an updated Fresh Air Elementalist build guide following the release of Heart of Thorns. I was pretty skeptical that Fresh Air builds would have a spot in DPS groups because with the overlap in traits of Bolt to the Heart and Fresh Air, that meant that Fresh Air builds were giving up a 9 to 10% damage modifier that other builds, say staff builds, could take advantage of. But with the release of Tempest and Overload Air, particularly from Tempest, Fresh Air builds now have a very strong spot in PvE, doing at least as much, if not a little bit more damage on small to medium hitboxes than staff builds. Also, this build scales remarkably well with Alacrity, so even in parties with a high amount of buffs, both staff and Fresh Air can do an amazing amount of damage. Also, the synergy between Fresh Air, auras, and some of the Tempest traits means that you can have a healer type Tempest as well that does a decent amount of damage if you're looking for an alternative healing spec. I invite you to try this build out and see what you think of it. The trait lines for the DPS variant of Fresh Air Tempest are Fire, Air, and Tempest. In Fire, take Burning Precision to cause your burning to last about 20% longer, as well as enable your critical hits to apply burning. Since your critical hit rate will be at about 100% after Food, Signet of Fire, and Banner of Discipline, and Fury, you'll be seeing a lot of burning procs from this trait. Sunspot will give you a fire shield when you attune to fire, which will have some very good synergy with the Tempest trait line later on. Pyromancer's Training uses the recharge on your very powerful fire weapon skills so that you can use Wildfire or Flame Wall and Burning Speed more frequently. There is also a 10% damage modifier while in Fire Attunement, but you won't be seeing a lot of use from that because you'll be in Air Attunement primarily. But Fire Attunement still has that 10% damage modifier against burning foes. And finally, Persisting Flames allows you to apply Fury whenever you use a blast finisher in any fire field, and it also extends the duration of your fire fields, such as those from Wildfire, Flame Wall, and Burning Speed. In Air, Ferocious Winds will give you 7% of your precision as a bonus to your ferocity. Electric Discharge will have a Lightning Strike proc on your foe as long as it's targeted when you attune to air. So that means since you'll be swapping to air so frequently with this build, you'll be seeing a lot of procs of this for just a little bit more damage. Pyromancer's Training is 190 precision while in air attunement, so you have great uptime from this and enables you to run more berserker gear than you would with a staff build. Also, this reduces the recharge on your air skills, so if you're using an offhand Warhorn, you're using Lightning Orb very frequently for that damage, or you have more access to CC through Cyclone. If using a Focus, that means you have Swirling Winds up very frequently and can really help contribute to projectile blocks with a group. Or if using an offhand Dagger, that means you can Ride the Lightning to get around very quickly. Weak Spot gives your critical hits a chance to cause vulnerability. Again, since you have a high crit chance, you'll be seeing a lot of use from this trait as well. And finally, Fresh Air is the key to this build, enabling you to overload air, swap out of air, and immediately swap back into air for yet another overload. This means you'll have some pretty amazing and pretty easy damage. In Tempest, Unstable Conduit enables your overloads to apply an aura to yourself once you're done channeling them. That means every time you're done channeling Overload Air, you'll apply a shocking aura to yourself. In open world, sometimes I will instead run Galsong for that emergency stun break, which has saved my life many times. But in raids or in fractal fights where I know I won't need that stun break, I really enjoy using Unstable Conduit for its synergy with Elemental Bastion. Whenever I apply an aura, I heal myself and anyone that gets that aura. So I overload and get that shocking aura, and heal myself for close to 800 in full Berserker gear. So that means I am keeping up my Scholar's buff in situations where a Staff Ellie would feel that increased pressure. At the Master level, Harmonious Conduit is a 10% damage modifier for 5 seconds after you finish overloading, and also gives you stability when you start your overload. This means that you can go in for an overload when you might otherwise be standing back because you'll get CC'd. Such as at Gorseval, when he is doing his pound attack, which knocks everyone back, you can hit your overload and face tank that blow because it doesn't really hit all that hard. And then since you have protection when you have that overload, you are taking less damage. An alternative, instead of using Elemental Bastion, if you really feel like you don't need those heals, or from that damage reduction from Frost Auras, you can take Imbued Maladies for that additional boon duration when using a Warhorn, if you happen to be using the offhand Warhorn. Now, a completely different variant of this build, which is much more supportive, would be to take water instead of fire, for powerful aura particularly, so that whenever you overload, or whenever you use, say, Shocking Aura, and of course whenever you shout, but that's group anyway, you'll apply that aura to not only yourself, but also to the people in your party. Then, you can trait that aura using Zephyr's Boon in air to grant Fury and Swiftness to all who are affected by it. And then finally, that aura will heal them for a decent amount of health, and of course you can swap your gear out and get even more healing from this at the cost of your damage. This kind of trait setup does hurt your DPS a little bit. You do have one 10% damage modifier from Aquamancer's training, but you'll probably see about a 5 to 10% damage decrease from taking water instead of fire, and also from taking Zephyr's Boon instead of Ferocious Winds. Another alternative is, instead of taking fire or water, take Arcane for renewing stamina, which grants vigor when you deliver a critical hit, and either Final Shielding, which can be useful in open world in case something happens to catch you off guard, or Elemental Contingency for all of that unavoidable damage in raids, so that you can have even more Fury or a little bit more Prot, or Vigor or Retail. And then of course, Bountiful Power. I know in raids I typically have 7 or more boons on me at any time, so this is a very strong 14% or more damage modifier in those situations. Again, you'll have Fury and Swiftness for yourself, plenty of Might from swapping attunements, probably a little bit of regen. You'll be getting Prot for yourself when you overload, as well as stability, and of course even more swiftness. So you'll be able to maintain at least 5 boons on your own, as well as the vigor from renewing stamina. So throw in a Mesmer or a Guardian and you'll easily have plenty of boons to make this a very strong modifier. If you want to use this build, at about 7 boons or so, you'll be seeing about a 3 to 5% DPS loss instead of using fire, but it is an interesting variant and gives you a little bit more party support. For gear, for a DPS build, I recommend full Berserkers, weapons and armor, as well as Assassins and Berserkers trinkets. Now, if you don't want to carry around 2 full sets of armor so that you can swap easily between a Fresh Air build and a staff build, you can instead, say, use Assassin's chest and pants for 70 precision there, and Berserker's trinkets. This will put you at about the same damage as using full Berserker's armor and then the Assassin's trinkets. The runes I still use are superior runes of the Scholar. This Fresh Air build has a lot of self-sustain, especially if you throw on a couple of shouts with auras, so you'll be able to maintain that Scholar's buff good amount of the time, even in raids. On your weapons, I recommend a Superior Sigil of Force and Superior Sigil of Air for most daytime scenarios. Though of course, having Sigils of Night are great for nighttime as well, or Sigil of Energy for more difficult fights, even though you'll be seeing a lot of damage mitigation through your HoT, as well as your extra heals from Warhorn and Overload Water. Or if you happen to be soloing a lot or in a less than stellar pug, a Superior Sigil of Strength can be very helpful to help boost your damage without needing to swap through other attunements and use blast finishers, or Overload Fire for that quick might stacking. If you'd like to use attribute boosting infusions, I typically use Precise infusions for its synergy with Ferocious Winds. Though power infusions are also very strong because power is not capped at level 80. For defensive gear options, Marauders is the least decrease in DPS, followed by Valkyries, and then finally Knights and Cavaliers. If you're using the Water Aura Share variant, instead of using Berserker's gear for maximum DPS, you could instead use a mix of Magi's and Clerics, probably using either Magi's weapons and Cleric's armor with Berserker's trinkets for kind of like the same effect as Celestial. Or you could just simply use a mix of Berserker and Celestial, or Berserkers and Minstrels for just decent damage and decent survivability. Or if you want to go all out, you could use Magi's weapons and armor with Cleric's trinkets for a full healer build. Though I would be careful because with that much toughness, you might actually end up tanking, so you'd want to consult your tank first if that's the case. Though if you have like a bar full of auras, Flash Freeze, Feel the Burn, and Aftershock, you can put out a lot of auras very quickly and keep your party pretty healthy. It's not quite the same kind of healing as, say, a Druid heal build, but you can help keep everyone up, help keep everyone very well buffed using all of those traits that buff your auras. If using that defensive gear, instead of using Harmonious Conduit, because that defensive gear is going to be anywhere between a 20 to say 40% DPS loss if you have at least any concern for your damage. Invigorating Torrents is again more boons for yourself and your party, Vigor and Regen. Regen's great with your healing power if using that defensive gear, so that everyone has yet even more healing, and Vigor is more dodges for them. Now for food for this build, I actually recommend using bowls of seaweed salad. When you're overloading or when you're using any of your skills, you can be moving, so it's very easy to strafe when using this build and maintain the rotation very easily. For more budget-friendly food, there are bowls of asparagus and sage salad, as well as experimental remnants, which you can buy in Cursed Shores after an event chain. For more difficult fights, if you find that your auras aren't enough to sustain yourself, you can use lifesteal food with either power or precision on it. Though if you're using the precision food, you'll want to have full Berserker's weapons, armor, and trinkets. And if using that full Berserker's weapons, armor, and trinkets, and you don't want to use the movement damage modifier food, you could also use plates of truffle steak. For casual content, I'll typically just use my Birthday Blaster since it's a moderate buff to power, precision, and ferocity, as well as condition damage, which helps with the burning damage just a little bit. If you can use a Slaying Potion, I highly recommend it for that 10% damage modifier, as well as 10% damage reduction. Though in raids, both Toxic Sharpening Stones and Bountiful Sharpening Stones have their uses. Toxic are again nice for that burning damage, though the Bountiful Sharpening Stones help with your boon duration for that prot, for that stability, for that extra might and fury you also apply. And so, especially if using a water build for that aura share, I would use Bountiful. Otherwise, whichever you prefer. For other content where you don't want to use expensive stones or potions, just a simple sharpening stone would do fine for that extra experience while working on your masteries, as well as that extra power. And of course, even though the main weapons for this build are Dagger, as well as Warhorn or Focus depending on the situation, you'll want weapons of all the other sorts. Scepter is very useful for might stacking, for example. Instead of going through all of your weapon swapping for 25 stacks of might, you can easily use a Scepter and Warhorn to stack 25. You'd want to start with Dragon's Tooth and Wildfire, Phoenix, Arcane Blast, and one more blast finisher if no one else contributes, then one more Dragon's Tooth, and then finally, use Heat Sink to copy that to everyone else. You have plenty of might on yourself, and then that gets doubled on everyone else. You have lots of Fury, again, it gets practically doubled for everyone else. Then you'd want to swap to Air Attunement to start an Air Attunement for the fight, and if you're using a Dagger, throw that on as well, so that you can open up with an Overload Air. So I have run this build before using a Scepter and Warhorn so that I can say kite into green circles at Veil Guardian. It's a little awkward, but it works out just fine, and mathematically the damage is very comparable. And of course, you'd want a staff as well in raids because Scorcival has such a large hitbox. You'll find that staff is a much better choice there than Scepter Warhorn or Dagger Warhorn. Air Tempest with a Dagger and Warhorn or a Scepter and Warhorn have access to a lot of fields and blast finishers. In Fire, both Burning Speed and Wildfire are fire fields, as well as your Overload Fire. And Heat Sink, while not a blast finisher, will grant yourself and your party might, and also will spread any fury you have to your party mates. In Water, Frozen Burst is a blast finisher on a relatively low cooldown, about 15 seconds before Alacrity. Additionally, Tidal Surge is decent damage and a solid heal, as well as a CC. And Water Globe is a water field, as well as, again, somewhat decent healing. Finally, Overload Water is yet another heal, though it's not a water field. In Air, Lightning Orb is a lot of damage and should be spammed off cooldown. Cyclone is another CC, but isn't a lot of damage, so you should prioritize your auto attack, Lightning Orb, any other damaging utilities you have, and of course your Overload over it. Shocking Aura is an aura on a relatively low cooldown, so if you were using Heal on Aura trait, Elemental Bastion, then this is a great way to help keep your Scholar's buff. Overload Air is of course a very, very hard-hitting skill and is central to this build. Additionally, it will apply a Shocking Aura to yourself for more healing, and grants you and your party mates a static charge which acts much like a Sigil of Airstrike, except it can crit. So this helps give your party a unique damage buff. This means, while solo, you probably want an elemental to benefit from this so that you can get a decent amount of damage from it, but also this means this Overload shines in groups over Overload Fire. Finally, in Earth, you have a Projectile Block with Ring of Earth, a Projectile Reflect, as well as a blast finisher on Sand Squall, and a Blind with Duststorm. Finally, Overload Earth, while it's not a lot of damage, is an Immobilize, which you can use, say, at Gorsival against the elite adds, and is also a blast finisher. If using a Scepter with this build, you also have blast finishers on Fire 2 and 3. One cool thing that I noticed when I was using this build, say at Veil Guardian, was that if you happen to have Snap Ground Target to Current Target, you can basically free cast Phoenix and Dragon's Tooth and get a pretty reliable hit from those, even when you're not looking at them or completely running away from them. If you happen to be using this Scepter variant, you'd basically still camp air, but spam Lightning Strike as much as you possibly can. Since it's an instant, it means you can still use this while channeling Overload Air, which is pretty much what makes this build's damage comparable to, say, Dagger Warhorn. Of course, you can use other offhands as well instead of just Warhorn. Focus is still very useful for Swirling Winds, Magnetic Aura, and Obsidian Flesh, and Flame Wall is still very relevant to your rotation. Fire Shield is yet another aura for more heals. And while Dagger is pretty much the same niche as Warhorn in terms of damage goes, Warhorn still out DPSs it just because you can use skills other than your auto attack while waiting for your overload to come off cooldown. But Ride the Lightning is still a lot of fun and a great mobility. And again, the blast finisher from Earthquake takes a little while to channel, so it's inferior to other blast finishers on other offhands, and Churning Earth is still very hard to line up its use in combat. But you can still use all three offhands, just Warhorn's the best offensive one, Focus is still great for defense, and Dagger can be used for bursts, say in open world, in base Tyria. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for a lot of Heart of Thorns content though. For your slot skills for this build, I recommend either Arcane Brilliance for easier content when the extra blast finisher will be beneficial, or Wash the Pain Away for the group heal that has quite a strong heal for yourself when you need to back off and just recover and get your rotation back in order. Though if you need more condition removal, Ether Renewal is always a strong choice. For your slot skills, Signet of Fire will contribute the most to your DPS in most circumstances, followed by Arcane Wave or Feel the Burn for at least targets with small hitboxes. And of course, Whiff of Storms in Air Attunement is also very strong for your DPS. So I will typically take 3 of those 4, typically using Feel the Burn and Arcane Wave for small hitboxes, Feel the Burn and Glyph of Storms if I need a little bit more sustain, or Arcane Wave and Lightning Storm for general running around if I'm going to blast a lot of fields. Other utility skills that can be useful are Flash Freeze for another aura on a low cooldown, Conjure Frostbow for the CC, as well as the damage for large hitboxes. Now note the CC on Conjure Frostbow is about the same as a 3-second daze, so it's not as grossly overpowered as before. And of course, Conjure Earth Shield for the invuln. Occasionally, I'll slot Aftershock for that extra magnetic aura on a relatively lowish cooldown, or Arcane Shield for that little bit of invuln, or Mistform again for the invuln, depending on the circumstances. When running around open world, specifically while gathering or something, I'll slot out Signet of Fire or Signet of Air, just so I can move around faster even without staying in Air Attunement or actively stacking Swiftness. For your Elite, I really tried to work Rebound into what I do, but a lot of times, I would pop it and then someone else would try to heal me, so it would render it useless. Or I would be just a hair too late or get interrupted when using it, and so in both cases I happen to get downed, which is kind of the whole point of taking the skill anyway. So instead, I've actually gone back to using Glyph of Elementals for a lot of cases, or Conjure Fiery Greatsword for shorter fights. Glyph of Elementals, again, in Air Attunement does great single target damage. In Fire Attunement, does a little bit better cleave damage, but also is a melee target, while air is ranged. And the Earth one, Earth Elemental, is very tanky, so that he can face tank something for quite a while, and also applies prot. while the Water Elemental, which I've started using more often in raids, has a heal as well as a knockback. Now, all of these Glyph of Elemental skills are affected by Alacrity. So if you happen to cast your Water Elemental and use its command skill, it's usually on a 15-second cooldown. That 15-second cooldown would also be affected by that Alacrity, bringing it down to a little bit under 10 seconds. So it's a nice little group heal on a very short cooldown. Similarly for the Prot on the Earth Elemental, or the Strong skill on the Fire Elemental. The rotation for Dagger Fresh Air is very simple. Start with Overload and Air Attunement, then once that is finished channeling, swap to Fire, and lay down either Wildfire from your Warhorn, which is the strongest fire field you have, or Burning Speed. If you're using an offhand focus, then use whichever fire field you feel like will be more beneficial. Flame Wall is a longer fire field, which is great for blasting, but Burning Speed is more damage overall. Once you have started channeling that fire skill, swap back to Air Attunement as soon as possible to start recharging that overload. Use Lightning Orb if you have that off cooldown, and Glyph of Storms in Air Attunement if you are using that utility, and then auto attack until overload is up. Use Overload Air, then swap back to Fire and use whatever fire field you have off cooldown, and then swap back to Air and repeat. Use your instants as they come off cooldown, in case or unless they have some sort of utility such as Aftershock. And if you need blast finishers, try to squeeze them in immediately after Fire Attunement in a part of your fire field that's not in the lightning storm created from your overload. If you are having issues with that, then I would recommend putting down your fire field, going into Air, using overload, and then since you have a fire field that's been down longer than your overload, use your blast finishers after Air, and then swap immediately back to Air. This is a DPS loss, but it enables you to blast that mite more safely and more reliably. The Scepter Rotation is a little bit more involved because you're spamming Lightning Strike while in Air Attunement. However, while in Fire, you can put down a fire field and a couple of blasts to help contribute some might without really affecting your DPS. You start off the same by overloading in Air, swap to Fire, and do the bare minimum that you need to do in Fire to get Air off cooldown, unless you need to stack might. So you would want to use Wildfire, or Flame Wall if using an offhand focus, or if those two skills are on cooldown, use either a Phoenix or a Dragon's Tooth. Then swap back to Air, and auto attack and spam Lightning Strike until you have either Lightning Orb off cooldown, or Overload is off cooldown and ready to go. And simply repeat that until the battle is over. You can always swap into Earth or Water Attunement instead of Fire if you need some of the utility from those attunements. So that's my new take on Fresh Air Elementalist builds following Heart of Thorns. I find them a lot of fun and a great change of pace from staff builds, and I hope you guys find them enjoyable as well. Thanks for watching!